Today we're going to go ahead and stretch some watercolor paper. We're going to reuse the back side of a paper. Maybe we didn't like the painting on the front side so much. Paper is expensive. This is a great way to recycle it. What I'm doing here is I'm taking a pencil and I'm adding a pencil line around the perimeter of the paper. This does a couple of things. It gives me an area where I'm going to tape the adhesive tape onto, but I'm also going to leave a white reveal around the perimeter of the between the painting and the tape. That way, when I go to mat it up, I actually I can use one mat because the white of the paper will work as a second mat, and so it's a classy way to go ahead and finish off a piece. I do like the idea of painting up to the edge by brush, by hand if you will, instead of using like a removable tape that's a little bit too, in my mind, is a little bit too mechanical. So this is a nice classy way to finish off the piece and prepare it. Again, I'm using watercolor paper, 140 pound. It's light enough that you really have to stretch it. I'm doing multiple pieces at one time. Here you can kind of see there's the white reveal around the painting. Watercolor paper, stretching it, the principle behind it is that you put enough water on the paper so to match your painting technique. If you like a lot of water, you're going to want to stretch the paper, have it absorb a little bit more water. If you don't use too much water with your watercolor painting, then you don't have to have as much water. Basically, the paper works like a sponge. It absorbs the water. When it absorbs the water, it expands. When it expands, and then it contracts. When it expands, you tape it in the expanded condition. When it dries, it shrinks and it gets tight. And why that's nice is that if you use water, which you will because it's watercolor paper, unstretched watercolor paper tends to get real wavy. It's difficult to frame and keep it flat. So the proper way really to do this is to go ahead and stretch your watercolor paper. Most of these sheets of paper that we're looking at here came off of a watercolor block, and those are pre-stretched. This is a way to reuse it. So here's the gum tape. I'm using 2-inch wide, mostly because I can't find 1-inch, and the 2-inch is very economical, comes in big rolls. What you have to do is I cut one length and one width, and then I cut the tape in half along the length, and then I actually end up creating 4 pieces, which are the 4 sides of the paper that we're going to want to tape. Here I'm using the paper as my ruler, if you will, the white paper, and I try to cut the gum tape about 1/2 inch longer than the length and 1/2 inch longer than the width. Here it is. I've taken the tape and I'm cutting it in half. Not too worried about making it a perfect cut. When you tape it, use the straight edge, the factory edge if you will, towards the artwork so that you don't end up with a raggedy edge. It's a little bit easier to manage and to keep organized. Again, we're taking a 2-inch wide piece of tape. This is gum tape, and we're cutting it in half. Dick Blick sells this tape. I think I got this off of Amazon, and they come in pretty big rolls. And so one roll, depending on how much you paint, can last for a very long time. And so in this demonstration, we're really doing stretching 3 papers at once. It's a little bit more efficient. I would wait till you have a number of paintings that you want to reuse. So here's my rain barrel outside. I'm only using it because it's convenient. I take the paper that I'm getting stretched and I soak it in the rain barrel. It doesn't have to stay in there a real long time, but I do like to get both sides well saturated. and try to get it to absorb as much water as possible. But again, you can see this is real time. I'm not spending a whole lot of time keeping this paper in the barrel. Even when I pull the paper off of the barrel or out of the barrel, it will still absorb water because on the surface there's a fair bit of water, and the longer the paper stays in the rain barrel, the more water it will absorb. And of course there is a point of where it will absorb as much as it will, and then it can't absorb anymore. It's a physical property. It's like a sponge. It can only absorb so much water. The longer it absorbs water, the more that the fibers spread apart to make room for the water that's displacing it. And the concept is, now here it is, the paper. You can see it, how it's glistening. That's a lot of water, and even while it's sitting on my washing machine there, it's still absorbing. There I'm just kind of rinsing off the excess water. Too much water when you're ready to tape is not your friend. So the paper should not be wet. It should just have that slight glisten to it. Again, you don't want it to be wet. You want it to be moist. And here you can see how it's still so shiny. It's already got too much water on it. So you can either take a sponge. I'm using a rag on it because I happen to have a rag handy, and I'm going to wipe off some of the excess water. There is a danger when the paper is too wet and you take the gummed tape and it's wet, and then you place it on top of the wet paper, that the water from the paper will wash away the adhesive, and there'll be no adhesive when the two materials dry for it to stick. So you're going to learn that probably from trial and error, so don't get frustrated that you just got too much water on it. And if you don't get enough water on it, then you have a similar problem where there's not enough adhesive to activate the you don't have enough water to activate the adhesive on the tape. So there is kind of a nice little sweet spot, but it's not a big learning curve. It's relatively easy to learn. So here I've sized up the boards that I'm going to be using, and in relationship to the paper that I'm going to be gluing it onto. There's the old painting. Let's place it down. I'm paying attention, kind of keeping it square to the edges of the paper. Too much water. So as I'm wiping, I'm also thinking about flattening out the paper with my rag here. Again, you can use a dry sponge and just take off any excess water. Watercolor paper has a sizing, factory sizing on it. If it didn't have a sizing on it, the paper would absorb the paint, watercolor pigment, like blotter paper, and it's extremely difficult to control. So the sizing is your friend. You don't want to rub and scrub too much and lose that sizing. So here's some water on my countertop. I use two hands, one hand to pull it, and I keep one finger on top of the tape, and as I'm pulling it, that other finger on the other hand keeps the tape in contact with the water. It's a simple way. You can buy a device, but why buy a device? Just use your finger. I like to let the adhesive, the water soften up the adhesive on the tape. So I don't run the tape and put it on immediately. I do all four pieces. I let them sit for a few seconds so that it actually softens up the adhesive. It's a good technique to use, because if you try to go too quick from wet tape, putting it on a wet paper, too much wet on wet will dissolve the adhesive, and you won't have enough adhesive to grab the paper. And you can kind of tell as soon as, if you've got too much water on it, when you push the tape on top of the paper like I'm doing now, if there's too much water on it, you can actually see the edges kind of peeling off, and so that's a telltale sign that you've got too much water, and redo it, because it won't get any better, believe me. And so again, I'm doing all four sides. You did notice that I let the the water sort of soften up the gum adhesive on it, and that sort of helps to activate the glue. And so everything is nice, everything is tight. We kind of repeat the same process for the other ones. Again, I'd recommend that you do multiples at the same time, so you've got kind of a assembly line set up, a little bit more efficient, if you will. We're going to get another look at my pulling the tape through the water here in a second. Wipe the edges. Mostly I'm concentrating on the edges, but I'm also kind of pushing the paper down to make sure that it stays flat. I mean, once the paper dries, I mean, it can be tight as a drum, or you can literally tap on it with your fingers. So it's a pretty strong, solid technique, and it will make your matting framing up watercolors a whole lot nicer, because you'll have a flat sheet of paper to work with. And you'll also have this pretty little white reveal around the perimeter of it that you bring your mat up to it and show that reveal is great. So here's the watering. I just take a little bit of water from the faucet. I dump it on the edge of the sink, on the surface of the sink. It's not very deep. It's probably, you know, a 32nd of an inch deep. Not a whole lot of water, just enough that will completely saturate the gum tape when I'm pulling it through it. I don't want to have so much of it that it soaks all the way through and the top of the paper is now wet. All I want to do is get the adhesive part wet, not the top part of it wet. So there it is. I'm using two hands. One hand to pull, the left hand is pulling, the right hand is stationary. I'm using one finger to keep the tape in contact with the water as I'm pulling it with the left hand. I take all four pieces and I let them sit. I let them soak a little bit of that water and soften up that adhesive. The following morning, this is the completed job. You can see the tape, and you can also see the pencil line. And again, you're going to paint up to the pencil line, and you're going to leave a little white reveal around the painting. And so later that day, I took one of these pieces and went to my life drawing class group, if you will. And here's the final piece from today's work. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed this, and if you would, please subscribe.